All right, we're jumping right in today to look at a process that's at the absolute heart of any company that makes, well, anything. We're talking about how a business goes from a simple sales forecast to a full-blown factory plan. Let's get into it. Have you ever really stopped to think about that? How does a giant company know exactly how many iPhones or cars to build when you walk into a store and the exact thing you want is just sitting there on the shelf? Believe me, that is not a lucky guess. No, it's not magic. It's a plan. A really brilliant chain of calculations. It all kicks off with one number, a guess about how many they're going to sell. And from that single number, a whole series of budgets just cascade down domino style, telling the factory exactly what it needs to do. So today, we're going to follow that chain. So our first stop on this journey is the production budget. I want you to think of this thing as the master blueprint for the whole operation. It's the critical link that translates what the sales team hopes to sell into what the production team has to build. And a really solid production budget does more than just meet today's sales goals. It's all about planning for tomorrow, too. The real trick is to make just enough to sell, plus a little extra as a buffer for the future, without going overboard and wasting a ton of money and resources. The formula itself is actually, beautifully simple. Let's imagine you're a baker for a second. You start with how many cakes you think you're going to sell today. Simple enough. Then you add how many cakes you want left on the shelf at closing time so you're ready for the morning rush. And finally, you subtract the cakes that were already sitting there from yesterday. What's left? That is exactly how many cakes you need to bake today. Let's see this in action with a real example. Okay, look at April. The company expects to sell 1,000 units. They want to have 120 units left over at the end of the month, and that's just 10% of what they think they'll sell in May. So their total need is 1,120. But they already have 100 units from the previous month, so you subtract that and there's your magic number. They need to produce 1,020 units. And that same logic just rolls over month after month. Okay, so we have our production plan. We know how many things to make. So what's the next logical question? Right, what do we actually need to buy to make them? And that brings us to the direct materials budget. This is basically the master shopping list for the entire company. And here's where you can really see that chain reaction I was talking about. You remember that units to be produced total we just calculated, that 4,100 for the whole quarter? That number isn't the finish line. Nope, it's the starting pistol for the entire next phase of planning. And look at that. The output from one budget becomes the direct input for the next one. Those 1,020 units we figured out we needed to make in April, it's the very first line on our shopping list for raw material A. It's this direct, unbreakable link that keeps the whole operation perfectly in sync. Now, what's really cool here is how these budgets aren't just static. They're planning for the future. For raw material A, check it out, the amount needed per product actually drops from 4 to 3 in June. Why? Because the company is planning on getting more efficient. And then for material B, the cost per unit drops from $10 to $8. They're obviously expecting to get a price break from their supplier. This shows you these are living documents, used to plan for costs and efficiencies, not just for counting parts. All right, you've seen the theory. You've seen how it all connects. Now let's get our hands dirty and put it to the test with a quick problem. You can follow along with me and see if you land on the same answer. Okay, here's the setup. We've got our sales projections for each quarter. And we know the company has a policy. They always want to have enough inventory left at the end of a quarter to cover 20% of the next quarter's sales. Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to figure out the production number for quarter 2. So, first things first, let's grab the number we know for sure. The sales forecast for quarter 2 is right there for us, 8,000 units. That's our foundation. Okay, next up, we need to figure out that desired ending inventory. Remember the policy? 20% of the next quarter's sales. Well, quarter 3 sales are pegged at 12,000 units, so 20% of that is 2,400. We'll add that to our 8,000. And for the final step, we just have to subtract the inventory we started the quarter with. Now, the beginning inventory for quarter 2 is just the ending inventory from quarter 1, right? So using that same 20% rule, it would be 20% of quarter 2 sales, which is 1,600 units. So we subtract that from our total. And there we have it. You take the 8,000 in sales, you add the 2,400 units you want for your safety stock, and you subtract the 1,600 you already had on the shelf. That gives us a grand total and our production target. 8,800 units. That's the number the factory needs to hit.
So we've been deep in the weeds with the math, but let's pull way back for a second. Why on earth do companies go through all this trouble? Why does this matter so much?
Well, because this whole chain of budgets, it's like the central nervous system for the company's operations. When you get it right, you don't run out of stock and make your customers angry. You don't waste a fortune storing stuff you don't need. You know exactly when you have to pay your suppliers, which helps manage cash. It's this detailed planning that lets a massive, complex business run like a well-oiled machine.
So the main takeaway is pretty clear. This whole process is how you turn a guess about the future into a concrete plan for today. But you have to remember, the entire process, this whole beautiful chain, it all hangs on that very first number, an educated guess. And that leaves us with one last really big question. In a world that's totally unpredictable, what happens when that guess is wrong? Now that's the real challenge.